Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Prince of Persia 2008. I played it on the Xbox Series X via backwards compatibility. If you have a disc, you can play it on the Xbox Series, Xbox One, 360. It's also available on the PS3 and Steam. So let's get into the story. You play as a guy who's not actually a prince. He is a thief who got lost in the desert and winds up, paired up with a princess who is battling a dark god. And that is the story of this game. You team up with Princess Elika, who is basically trying to stop the release of Ahriman, who is this giant dark god. There's also an epilogue DLC, and I gotta say that ending is very clearly meant to be starting a franchise, and that unfortunately didn't happen. And the epilogue, I like the story, I like where it's going, I like what it's setting up, but since it didn't pay off, it's kind of painful. I like the ending to the main game a bit more because you can see it leading to a franchise, but it could also just be an ending. But let's get into the audio, and the first thing I'm going to say is the voiceover work is very well done. It's got Nolan North as the not prince. Not unlike the regular Prince of Persia games, you don't get his name ever. And I think the gal who did Elika's voice did a wonderful job. I think she did great bringing the character to life and just capturing her personality, or giving her personality. As for the sound effects, I think the sound effects in the main game are very good. I think the sound effects in the epilogue are missing in some places. That being said though, overall I do enjoy the music. I think the music is very well done throughout the entire game. Now as for the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, this is similar to the other Prince of Persia games in that it is action, like combat focused, as well as a lot of traversal. But one thing that holds this game back over the previous ones is the item collection. There are these light seeds, and there's like 900 or something. You can go and collect them all, there's an achievement for it, but quite frankly, I felt the light seed collection kind of dragged the overall experience down a bit. And while I think the traversal works well overall, there are these things called plates, and you use them in a special way with magical powers. And a couple of them are fine, they basically do the exact same thing, but there's a couple where like you have to control the character while you're using them. Like one, you'll be running on walls and you have to avoid obstacles, and one you'll be flying and have to avoid obstacles. And I feel like that's just weird because you have two that don't do anything and they just move you on their own, and then two where you have to like play a little mini game. So it's just kind of this weird balance, either all need to be a mini game or none, and quite frankly the whole dodging thing doesn't always work great. Like, it'll look like there's no way in hell there's enough room to dodge to the left, so you don't, or you think you'll make it anyways, or you'll dodge to the right, but then you were supposed to dodge to the left and somehow you make it through. It just doesn't work quite well. The combat has also been very, very revamped in this game. You don't run into groups of enemies. Anytime you run into an enemy, it's basically a one-on-one encounter, whether it's a grunt or a boss. Which you also have multiple encounters with the bosses. You have like 4 or 5 in total. But they have this big old health bar at the bottom, and you have to whittle it down through various methods in combat, whether it's your sword, whether it's Elika's attack, other things you can do. But there's also kind of a trick where some of the enemies, if you pin them against a wall, it's like insta-death. Some of them you can knock them off insta-death. And you can do that with a lot of the bosses as well. But it is a really interesting way of going about the combat. It's very different and very unique from what they did previously. And by previously, I mean the Two Thrones, because this game actually came out between Two Thrones and Forgotten Sands. Even though it's a completely separate game, it was meant to kick off its own Prince of Persia franchise. And honestly, I wish it had. I will say some of the combat and traversal does feel a little clunky, and there are some QTEs that I just don't think work well. They don't necessarily give you enough time to even recognize the button you need to press, and it happens pretty consistently. But in this game, you really never die, and the punishment for failing these things isn't that severe, which is a little weird, but they make it work, although there are times where it does feel out of place. Now, unfortunately, in the epilogue, like, a lot of the gameplay mechanics don't seem to work as well as they do in the main game. I don't know what it is or why, but the combat feels janky and like everything feels a little sped up. Not you, of course, but the enemies feel like they're doing everything just a little faster than they were, and it throws off all the timing you've gotten used to. And that accounts for the traversal as well. So the epilogue is not really a great add-on in my mind in that sense. Because you've gotten used to this main game and how everything works, and then you start playing the epilogue and it just doesn't work quite as well as it did in the main game. Like, nothing does. Now let's get into the controls. And I gotta say, overall, the controls are good. They're not quite perfect. I don't think they're as precise as I would like them to be. Even in the main game, there were definitely times where I felt like I had aimed in the right direction to jump in and the prince does something different. I call him the prince, he's not a prince. But however bad that was, it all felt way worse in the epilogue. Again, for some reason, nothing worked as well in the epilogue. Overall, I do like the way the controls interact with the game. You have your sword attack button, you have your Elika attack button. I know that sounds weird. You have your gauntlet attack button, you have your gauntlet use in traversal, and it all works pretty well. But then you get to the epilogue and that all feels kind of broken and none of it feels like it's working quite as well. And that could be due to the timing thing that I mentioned earlier, but either way, it's still ugh. Now let's get into the graphics and visuals, and this game diverges immensely in the fact that it is cel shaded. It fully goes for a much cartoonier and comic booky look. More comic book than cartoony, I would say. But they also really use colors, and I love the colorful elements of this game. I love the colorful world. I love how the prince and Elika are dressed. I think that's all really well done. I like the animations in the main game. I also really like the enemy design. I think it fits with what they're doing overall, and I think the cel-shaded, really comic booky, almost hand-drawn look really fits with it, and they really use it well and make it work very well. Unfortunately, in the epilogue, you run into some weird animation issues. Like, there's a point where Elika runs off and her running animation is just so janky and doesn't look right. It doesn't look like anything she's done before. It's just kind of weird and out of place, and it makes the epilogue feel a little more tacked on. The one thing this world does do that is disappointing, because I know I've praised the other Prince of Persia games for it, is that this world really does feel like it's built for the traversal, not so much that you are traversing through the world. It's one of those things where they're like, hey, we want you to be able to get through here this way, so let's just put some set dressing on it. So it just feels kind of lazy in that sense, which is unfortunate because the visuals are so beautiful, and the previous games have done such a good job with making it feel like you're traversing a world rather than the world is built to be traversed, you know? It's just one of those things that really destroys world building as a whole. So to wrap this up, I gotta say that replaying the Prince of Persia games has honestly been kind of soul-destroying. I remember some of these games being far better than they hold up to be. I mean, because some of them just really don't hold up at all. That being said, I do think this is the best of them. I really enjoyed going back and replaying this. I will say, though, with how the epilogue ends, given that it's really meant to be going into a franchise, you can skip the epilogue. Just picking up the base game will not hurt you in the slightest. You really won't be missing anything skipping out on the epilogue. And since the Xbox version is the only version I know that you can get the epilogue, you can't get it on Steam as far as I'm aware, you're okay. That being said, I do recommend this one. This is the Prince of Persia game that I had the most fun going back and revisiting. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, do you remember that Ubisoft was planning on doing a remaster of Prince of Persia? Because I remember that, and I'm wondering if it's actually still going to happen. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one. Hoping this was going to turn into the beginning of a Prince of Persia. Fuck, words!